Aaron, would you
Good job, Marty.
my first failure as the host?
So Christian Burgess is the director of the Disaster Distress Helpline, as well as many other things. Christian has been a colleague for many years, and his efforts provide hope and support to disaster survivors across the country 24/7 in multiple languages. He's just an all-around great guy, and so we wanted to invite him to share about what he and his organization does, so that we all know about it and can refer people, and also as disaster responders take advantage of the services as well. That's one of the things I don't think we talk enough about, is supporting one another. So we sent out kind of a quick little introduction, and we'll turn it over to Christian. We'll turn over to Christian. We're going to aim for about 15 minutes or so, 15-20 minutes of presentation, followed by some Q&A, and we'll take it from there. Christian, thank you so much.
Well, thank you again, Aaron, and for the invitation. I always appreciate opportunities to share information about the Disaster Distress Helpline and our parent organization, Vibrant Emotional Health. And just thank you all as well for making the time to listen to my presentation. Some of you that were in the meeting at the start might have heard me say that I will be sending some slides to Aaron for follow-up, because in the 15 minutes that I have, I won't be able to cover everything, of course, but the slides that I'll share will have more information that you can go back to, and website links and things like that.
And we're not gonna hold you exactly to 15 minutes or anything, just so you know. We're flexible.
I'll try to keep it moving though. And let me go ahead and share my screen, and so everybody can see, I think. Well, again, thanks for letting me join this meeting of area welfare and self-reliance specialists and Voad representatives with LDS charities, and whatever role that you might be playing in the movement. This is an exciting opportunity for me, for you all, to get to know more about the project, as well as later in the presentation for us to talk about ways that you can support the purpose of the Disaster Distress Helpline, which is to provide 24/7 crisis and emotional support to anyone in the United States experiencing distress or other mental health concerns related to disaster. But before I get into my presentation, I do have to give a standard disclaimer that any views or opinions, content that's in this presentation does not necessarily reflect the views of our funder, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or its associated federal agencies. Just a standard disclaimer there, but I never really say anything that controversial, so hopefully that won't be an issue. So as Aaron mentioned, my name is Christian. I'm director of the Disaster Distress Helpline for Vibrant. My contact information is up here. Again, this will be in the slides that I'll send and follow up. And this being a presentation, don't think of it as a one-off thing either. Any of you that feel like you want to connect after this presentation with more information or resource requests, other ideas for coordination, please don't hesitate to reach out. This is why I'm here, to form those connections. So I'm going to be presenting on the Disaster Distress Helpline project, as well as an additional resource from our parent organization, Vibrant, which is called the Crisis and Emotional Care Team. I'll save that towards the end of the presentation and just give a little bit more information about what we do at Vibrant. This video link is, I don't have time to share it this evening. It's about 5 minutes long, but after the meeting, at some point, when you get the slides, I recommend checking out this short video. Last year, the Disaster Distress Helpline turned 10 years old. We were launched in 2012 as the nation's only crisis hotline dedicated to supporting disaster survivors and responders. And our origins actually go back to the September 11th terrorist attacks, as well as Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and that was the year that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline launched, which is now called the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. And those were two seminal events that led to the creation of the Disaster Distress Helpline in 2012, because they were disasters that demonstrated the need for a specialized crisis hotline expressly for disaster survivors and responders. So this video will tell you a little bit more. Again, you'll get this information after the presentation, but you can also just go to YouTube and search Disaster Distress Helpline, and that should show up in your search results. But highly recommend that people check out this video that will talk a little bit more about the history and the purpose of the project. And before I get into the heart of what the Disaster Distress Helpline is, a little bit to break down sort of how we operate, because there are a lot of different players that really make the Disaster Distress Helpline what it is. And I'll start with our funder, which is the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It is a branch of the Department of Health and Human Services. And we are 100% federally supported program under SAMHSA. And SAMHSA is under HHS, is also with other organizations like the Centers for Disease Control, the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response, which is kind of the public health branch of the U.S. government, the Administration for Children and Families. So SAMHSA is sort of right along with those federal agencies. And that's another role that SAMHSA plays. They're not just our funder, they're also a partner in the Disaster Distress Helpline. We work very closely with SAMHSA throughout the disaster cycle as a federal resource, but also as a connection to those other federal agencies that I mentioned, including as a connection with other federal partners like FEMA and the Small Business Administration and other agencies as well. SAMHSA also operates other disaster programs, including what they call their Disaster Technical Assistance Center. So that's another thing that we do with our funders. We partner with them on DTAC. And SAMHSA also administers FEMA-funded crisis counseling programs, which some of you in the call may be familiar with that. When there are federal disaster declarations made that involve public assistance, their then funding streams then open up for the launch of crisis counseling programs that are dedicated to emotional and spiritual care for impacted communities. And SAMHSA administers these grants typically through state departments of mental health, but in crisis counseling programs, there are many partners involved. And some of you may have been CC partners in the past as well, because it's meant to be a whole community response and really have several components to ensuring that people impacted by disasters have the emotional and spiritual care support that they need in recovery. So SAMHSA also plays a key role in administering these crisis counseling programs. And so that's another way that we're involved with SAMHSA. So who I work for, though, is a private non-for-profit called Vibrant Emotional Health. We are the administrator of the Disaster Distress Helpline. So SAMHSA funds the program, and we operate it through what's called a cooperative agreement, which is basically a grant. And we've been operating the Disaster Distress Helpline through this funding since its launch in 2012 in partnership with SAMHSA. So as the administrator of this program, basically what that means is we administer the operations, the telephony, the technical components. We develop and monitor standards, trainings, and practices that crisis centers that comprise our network, which I'll explain in a moment, that these crisis centers have to follow in order to be a part of this network. We maintain the communications and outreach for these programs, including what I'm doing right now. We maintain advisory steering committees and task forces for these programs to make sure that we're getting subject matter expertise and lived experience from providers like yourselves from across the country. We do evaluation efforts for the program. So that's our role as an administrator. But what the heart of the Disaster Distress Helpline is our network of independently operated crisis centers that actually comprise the Disaster Distress Helpline and the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which we're considered a sub-network of. So basically what that means is that SAMHSA also funds 988. And as a part of 988, we maintain this specialized service for disaster responders and survivors, which is the Disaster Distress Helpline. We do have a separate number than the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which I'll explain in a moment. But the reason why we're a sub-network of 988 is because that ensures that the crisis centers we work with have a level of accreditation and training that they first have to meet in order to be a part of the 988 network. And then once they have that, they can then apply to operate services like the Disaster Distress Helpline. So hopefully that makes sense. The 988 Lifeline network is much larger than the Disaster Distress Helpline. Currently, there are over 200 centers that comprise the 988 Lifeline. And again, these are all independently operated crisis centers located around the country and in all 50 states and in 2 of the 5 US territories. And with 988, when people call or text 988, those calls get routed to their local center. However, as a sub-network, the Disaster Distress Helpline, we have a national routing model, meaning when somebody calls or texts the Disaster Distress Helpline, it's just routed to the next available center. We don't have a local routing model because we don't need it with the Disaster Distress Helpline. With 988, it's much more likely that somebody reaching out to 988 might be experiencing an acute crisis that may involve emergency intervention, which is why it's really important for local centers to answer those calls. With the Disaster Distress Helpline, however, we have the same standard of care for any caller or texter, no matter where they're calling around the country. But as I'll explain, when people call the Disaster Distress Helpline, they can still be connected with their local center or other local services for follow-up care and support. So that's sort of how we interact with 988. We're a sub-network. We also support all 988 centers as a part of the Disaster Distress Helpline in times of disaster. We provide them with standards, trainings, and practices in disaster mental health because all crisis centers serve their communities in times of disasters, no matter what service they're reaching out to, whether it's 988 or another local crisis hotline that the center may operate in their community. And so we also work to make sure that all crisis centers have the resources they need to support their communities in times of disasters. And that's a part of our funding through SAMHSA is to do that. The other thing I'll say about our network of independently operated crisis centers is that they're all playing vital roles throughout the disaster cycle. And so part of what we do within the Voad movement is represent crisis center interests. That's one of the reasons why I do presentations like this. It's one of the reasons why Vibrant is a member organization of National Voad, is because we're not just representing programs like the Disaster Distress Helpline, we're also representing crisis centers within the movement. And it's been a goal of mine in the 10 years I've been involved in Voad to get more crisis centers involved in their local or state Voad chapters. Many of them are, but many of them aren't. And so it's been a long-standing goal of mine to do that through our work with 988. The DDH network is, like I mentioned, much smaller. Currently, we have 6 crisis centers in our network. We have 3 call centers, 2 text centers, and a video phone center for deaf and hard of hearing folks, and a peer support crisis center. One of our crisis centers is the same. That's why it's 6 that are operating these 7 services. But and I'll explain more about these programs in a moment. So you can see the different scale with the DDH. We have 7 crisis centers in our sub-network, whereas 988 has over 200. So that tells you a little bit about the difference in scope. And then finally, just to explain it further, 988 has other sub-networks as well. We also have a Veterans Crisis Line sub-network that the Veterans Administration mostly operates and funds outside of SAMHSA, but we provide the backup services for Veterans Crisis Line through the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. So anyway, it's a little bit complicated to explain, but that's another of our sub-networks is the Veterans Crisis Line, which people can actually reach by calling or texting 988. And there's a special menu option that you can press to get to reach the Veterans Crisis Line. The final key player in the Disaster Distress Helpline that I always mention is you. Again, we are 100% federally supported. This is a service that relies on folks like yourselves to promote our resources because you're boots on the ground, you're working in communities year round across the country and the roles that you play and in times of disaster. And so you're the ones who are promoting our resources, not just to communities you serve, but also among your staff as wellness and self-care resources. You're helping us to reach communities with access and functional needs. including language or ability. And the other thing about you being a key stakeholder in the disaster distress helpline is it's about ownership. I mentioned we have steering committees and task forces that advise our project. Partly we have that because we need buy-in from constituents and key stakeholders like yourselves to make sure that we're running the service according to what you feel like are best practices. And because we're 100% federally supported, you're also paying for the service through its taxpayer dollars. And so we want to make sure that we're spending that money responsibly as a federally supported resource and through these steering committees and advisory task forces as well. So again, all of you are also key stakeholders in the disaster distress helpline. So what is the service? Our core services are a 24/7 crisis hotline, which the number is 1-800-985-5990. And the key point here being we are 24/7, 365. With many disaster services, as you all know, there's this idea that we might stand up in times of disaster, but the disaster distress helpline is always available. And I emphasize that too, because there's always a disaster happening somewhere, or there's always someone recovering from a disaster somewhere, beyond the disasters that make the headlines. And that's why SAMHSA created the service, is to guarantee that there would always be a crisis and emotional support resource available year round whenever a disaster occurs. And so that's our core purpose there, is to provide that 24/7 service. What we do is we assist individuals and families experiencing distress related to disaster in order to help them move forward on the path of recovery. We provide brief supportive interventions that are designed to help people feel listened to, validated, to explore coping, to identify social supports, and to help them understand what resources are available in their community for follow-up care and support, whether that's might be general mental health or behavioral health resources, or it might be disaster specific resources. And so at our heart, we help people to not feel alone in times of disaster, because that's often what happens, is that people feel isolated. They might feel like everybody else seems to be recovering except for me. They might have been exposed to traumatic situations in times of disasters that might lead to more serious mental health concerns, like depression or anxiety or substance abuse. So for all of those reasons, this is why we exist. And we're helping people to just keep going on the path of recovery so that they can fill out those disaster recovery applications, so that they can rebuild, so that they can get the help that they need in order to move forward on that path of recovery. Some other key parts of our service is that we are, and Aaron mentioned this at the top of the call, we are multilingual. We have live 24/7 crisis counseling in Spanish via our call and text options, and those are answered by live bilingual crisis counselors. Callers to our hotline can also connect with counselors in over 100 other languages via third-party interpretation services. In reality, it's closer to 200 languages. I always drop it down a bit because some of the less commonly spoken languages in the United States might not be available 24/7 and might require an actual appointment with a third-party interpreter. But for most commonly spoken other languages in the United States, there is a 24/7 third-party interpretation option that we can connect people to. And that's a really important thing to be aware of, because it's difficult for us, it's challenging for us to let English as a second language communities in the United States know that this is an option and that it's available. And so if any of you serve communities where there are large numbers of ESL, English as a second language speakers, then keep that in mind as a resource. Something that we launched in 2021 that we're really excited about is our video phone option for deaf and hard of hearing American Sign Language users. People who are deaf or hard of hearing can use their video phone enabled devices or a web-based ASL Now link on our website, which I'll share in a moment, to connect directly with trained DDH crisis workers that are fluent in ASL, and many of whom are also deaf or hard of hearing. So it does not rely on third-party relay interpretation services. This is a person-to-person emotional support resource for people who are deaf and that have been impacted by disasters. And we launched that in 2021. And one thing I'll note about our video phone is that in the 2 years since our launch, we've had over 2,000 calls. In the 8 years prior, the first 8 years of the disaster distress helpline, when we had only offered a TTY option for deaf and hard of hearing folks, as a dedicated service for the deaf and hard of hearing community, we had 0 TTY calls. And in fact, most TTY options are not utilized by the deaf community. It's considered an outdated technology. There might be some people that still use TTY devices, and those are the what you might have seen where it's somebody typing on a machine, and on the other end, it's being received and then being typed back. And that might also have a third-party relay connection to a hearing service. But with the advent of video phone technologies in general, like Zoom and like FaceTime and things like that, and smartphones, TTY devices have become obsolete for the most part within the deaf community. And chat and text options are also options for the deaf and hard of hearing, but chat and text are in English. American Sign Language is different from English. And for many deaf and hard of hearing people, that's their primary preferred language, is American Sign Language. And so what the video phone does is it provides that direct access in American Sign Language. But keep in mind that our text option is still an option for deaf and hard of hearing folks, particularly those who may not use ASL or who might be late deafened, like veterans or people who might have had hearing loss as a result of age or as a result of other disabilities or medical issues. So text is still an option for deaf and hard of hearing, but for American Sign Language users, we have this video phone option now. Another thing that we launched in 2021 that we were really, really excited about is our online peer support program, which connects disaster survivors and responders across disasters within what we call online peer support communities on Facebook. Now, Facebook has hundreds of peer support groups, and Facebook is still a platform that people use in times of disaster. People go to Facebook and other social media when there's a crisis to check in with their loved ones, to talk about how they're doing, to feel connected with other people if they feel isolated. And so in 2021, we launched this program in reflection of the use of social media in times of disaster. But what sets us apart from other peer support programs on social media is that ours has 24/7 background support from one of our crisis centers to make sure that our communities are moderated and safe spaces. And they're private groups. You have to answer questions in order to join. You have to identify as one of 2 disaster types. We have one peer support community for survivors of mass violence, and we have one peer support community for survivors and responders of the COVID-19 pandemic. These communities are also staffed with trained peer supporters that are employed by Vibrant and that are actually in the community providing peer support to the members. Our survivors of mass violence community has approximately 2,000 members right now, and our survivors and responders with COVID has about 1,000 members. So they're growing and again, offer that peer connection through the disaster distress helpline. And another feature of this service is what we call crisis support over Messenger, which allows members of these communities to use the Messenger chat feature to connect directly with a trained DDH crisis counselor if they're experiencing distress or other mental health concerns, and they can access that 24/7. And this is a technology that we developed in partnership with Facebook that essentially allows that one-on-one exchange directly with the crisis counselor who's receiving this exchange at their workstation and their crisis center. So, so the person just accesses Messenger through the group, and then they can engage in a chat session with one of our counselors. So I know I'm already probably running short on time. I have additional resources here, our SAMHSA website, which I encourage folks to go to check out information and resources for providers. We have information about disaster distress risk groups and for particular disaster types. We also have on the website information in Spanish and American Sign Language and many other resources that you can access. We also have a special website that we call strengthafterdisaster.org, which is an online platform for sharing stories of hope and strength during recovery across disasters. These are mostly curated through other sites, but it's intended to be sort of like a clearinghouse of stories of hope and strength during recovery, that's searchable by disaster type like tornado or hurricane, so that when people are struggling during recovery, they can read these stories to learn about what has helped other people get through any struggles they've had during recovery. We also have social media on Facebook and Twitter, which I encourage you to connect with us year-round. And we have materials that we can send to you for use in the field. And again, year-round, not just in times of disaster. And those would be shipped to you for free and at no cost. How am I doing on time, Aaron? Should I wrap it up?
Yeah, now would probably be a good time to move to Q&As, probably, if that works for you.
Yeah, and I've already mentioned most of what I'm skirting through now. This is all going to be in the slides that I'm going to send to you afterwards. And that's just more information about our specialized services that I just went over. And as I'll just keep this screen up as we get into any questions that people may have about the Disaster Distress Helpline. Or I might have been so thorough that and sorry, I don't know if anybody had any questions in the chat, but I don't think I see any.
I don't think there's any in the chat, but yeah, if people can ask questions in the chat or just unmute yourself.
Christian, did you say the 988 is available in all 50 states?
No, just like the Disaster Distress Helpline, 988 is a national service. So for the DDH or 988, you can call or text from anywhere in the US and the US territories. So yes, and it's 24/7. The only difference being that when you call or text 988, you're more likely to reach a local crisis center, whereas with the Disaster Distress Helpline, we are a national service, meaning you're just reaching the next available crisis center. And so the other thing with that, and why we modeled it that way too, is with the Disaster Distress Helpline, is that having a round robin routing model versus a local, it allows us better surge protection in times of disaster, so that any one center isn't overwhelmed if they're in a particular area where a disaster has occurred. So this allows us to manage our volume more efficiently by sharing it across crisis centers.
Quick question for you. This is Robert Mortensen from New Mexico. Do you have anything with regards to Navajos as far as suicide helpline kind of thing?
Did you say Navajo?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a great question. A couple of things. We do strive to provide culturally sensitive and appropriate care across all of our services. So we want people to understand that anyone, it's not just any state or territory, right. Anyone can call or text our services. And we have a standard of care that everyone is treated with sensitivity and appropriate if it's disclosed in the session that they may belong to a particular tribe or ethnic or racial or any other representation around the country. So for the Disaster Distress Helpline, people who use Navajo as their primary preferred language, which I understand is still commonly used, probably especially New Mexico and other southwestern states, Navajo is one of the languages offered through our third-party interpretation. And we actually have Disaster Distress Helpline information in Navajo for that reason, which I can send at request. And the links that I'm going to send after this, the website, you can access this kind of information through the web links that I'll share as well. So that's one thing. 988 actually, when they launched last year, because 988 was just launched last year, it used to be the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and it used to have its own 10-digit number. And through federal legislation, actually launched last year as the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. The goal of 988 is actually to divert, one of the goals of 988, I should say, is to divert mental health calls from 911. And it's an easy to remember number that people in mental health crisis or have loved ones can call. And a part of 988 is to create specialized services. One is for LGBTQ youth, because that's a group that's disproportionately at risk for mental health concerns. And there are other veterans They're also in the legislation, it was rural populations and American Indian and Alaska Native. The American Indian Alaska Native component is slowly being implemented and has started with what's called 98 Native and Strong in Washington State, where people in Washington actually have a fourth menu option where they can press 4 to be connected to crisis counselors who are who belong to tribes in Washington State. It's a peer-driven line. The reason why it hasn't rolled out nationally is because every state has to adopt their own Native and Strong lifeline, because the goal of it is to staff it with people from the tribes that are located in that state. And as you all may know, there are over 500 recognized tribes, I believe, in the United States. So it'll be a slow rollout and states have to fund these services as well. But that is something that's offered in Washington State and something that we hope to replicate in other states, including for the Navajo Nation. And
Thank you.
that in Washington with Native and Strong, there are Navajo, there are large Navajo communities in Washington, and they do have some members of the Navajo Nation that staff the 98 Native and Strong in Washington. But that's only available to residents of Washington State right now, not nationally. So hopefully that answers your questions, Robert.
Thank you.
Yeah. These are just some ways that folks that we can continue this collaboration. We want you to promote our resource to the individuals and communities that you serve, including as a resource for self-care among your staff and volunteers. I should say too, because we're a crisis hotline, we are confidential and anonymous. The only exception to that is when someone indicates that they might be in imminent danger to themselves or others, which does happen on the disaster distress helpline as well as 988. It's rare, but it does happen, in which case we might need to get identifying information in order to activate a rescue. However, the vast majority of our contacts are confidential and anonymous. And that's important to know with responder communities who might have stigma about reaching out to services like this, or among their own staff and volunteers. We also want you to provide us with information. Crisis cleanup is an example of this, where crisis cleanup is one of the resources that we use with our disaster distress helpline crisis centers and their referral databases. So if you're ever aware of any other general or disaster specific resources that you want us to consider for inclusion in our crisis center resource database, then you can always send it my way. We want you to connect with us on social media, as I mentioned, year-round and in the aftermath of disaster. And we want you to include our services on any websites that you might have, blogs, press releases. That's another way that you can promote us to the communities that you serve. And also, if you're working within your Voad chapter or in your roles in coordinating emotional and spiritual care services year-round and in the aftermath of disaster, then we want you to reach out to us as well if you want more information and resources for the disaster distress helpline. So just keep those things in mind after this call and always. And I'll also share just a little, this is going to be in the slides that I send you, but Vibrant also operates what's called a crisis and emotional care team, which is actually a group that we deploy around the country upon invitation that is comprised of mental health volunteers and who can provide clinical debriefings with impacted communities and providers. Those are some examples of the deployments that we've done through the crisis and emotional care team. And I have contact information for the CECT at Vibrant that'll be in the slides. And again, that's my information. So I think,
Kristen, it sounds like you're covering the waterfront. And I was curious about the ASL materials after seeing the movie Coda, which has brought that more to people's attention, and then Navajos with the Wind Talkers movie. You can see I go to far too many movies, but has there been a change in the trend of what you're receiving? For example, COVID has been reputed to be a big issue with mental health and suicides and things of that nature. Are there any notable trends over the last few years that are insightful?
Yes, and Aaron, I just realized I'm running about 10 minutes over, so thank you for the generosity of time. That happens with me. I always lose track of time. But to answer your question, John, yes. At the onset of the COVID pandemic, our volume increased by 900% compared to the year prior, related to feelings of isolation, anxiety. Our peer support community with COVID involves people who have long COVID symptoms, which can include mental health effects of COVID. We also have we've heard from a lot of people who've experienced loss as a result of COVID, and economic disruptions, and you name it. For 2 years, 2 solid years, it was the #1 presenting issue to the DDH, and it continues to be one of the most common presenting issues, right along with hurricanes and tropical storms and other severe weather. After Hurricane Ian and Fiona last year, that sort of started to shift things a little bit away from COVID for the first time since the onset of the pandemic. But it's still very much a common issue of our callers and texters.
Wow. Christian, my brain is full.
Yeah. Thanks again for all the time. I know it's a lot of information. Aaron, I'm going to be sending these slides to you after, so that folks can have them for reference and to go back and read and get a little bit even more information. But I just really appreciate the time and for allowing me to go over a little bit.
Robert, did you have a question for him?
No, my
Okay.
question had to do with the Navajos.
All right.
We'll make sure that gets out both to this group and the larger group as well. Thank you, Christian, so much for your time.
Thanks
Yes.
a lot. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good evening.
Very
Bye-bye.
good.